Halloween didn't begin as a night to fear the dead. It started as a night to feed them. And the most terrifying thing, people thought that was normal, necessary, even polite. So what happens when a civilization treats death as a guest, not an enemy? And what if the famous thin veil wasn't a poetic metaphor at all, but a carefully timed ritual window anchored by stars, mounds, and a calendar older than Rome? Preliminary and promise our mystery starts with a paradox. The Halloween you know, pumpkins, costumes, candy, stands on a much older, more unsettling foundation called Samhain. It wasn't a festival of gore. It was a treaty, a pact between the living and the unseen, renewed when the year broke in half and the world went soft at the edges. Tonight, we're going to follow the breadcrumbs through time. We'll decode why the Celts chose this exact night to open doors no one else dared to touch. And we'll test the thin veil against archaeology, myth, and medieval memory. We'll see how a Roman-style empire in the medieval church tried to tame it, and how it slipped their fingers anyway, evolving into guising, soul cakes, Guy Fawkes mischief, and finally, trick-or-treat. We'll separate folklore from fake lore, including the invented Celtic death god who never existed, and we'll track the shadows to a cave in Ireland once called the entrance to hell. If you think Halloween is innocent fun, or pure Christian cover-up, or just corporate candy, stay with me. The truth is stranger, older, and closer to you than you think, because treaties once made have long memories. Main body, let's begin where the boundary thins to a knife edge. A windswept royal complex in the west of Ireland called Rathcroghan. When night fell on Samhain, people said the earth itself opened there. A cave, Oweynagat, the cave of cats, breathed out creatures and queens and armies that didn't belong to the daylight. If you stepped in at the wrong time, you might not come out the same. One night, a story says, a young warrior named Nera was dared to tie a willow withe around the ankle of a corpse hanging from the gallows. Only on Samhain, they said. Only then would the dead be cooperative. The rope loosened. The body asked for water. Nera took the corpse, still dripping, to a house where a woman gave them a drink only after warning not to spill it inside. The corpse tossed the water on the threshold anyway. The house exploded into flames. Nera fled back into the night, shaken, and discovered something worse. In a blink, in a breath, his whole world had changed. He saw his own home in ruins, his people scattered. Had he slipped into the Otherworld, or into the future? Time doesn't behave itself on Samhain. It bends, it creeps, it tests you, and that was the point. Long before monks copied these tales into vellum, the people who kept the old calendar carved their year into two halves, a light half and a dark half, summer and winter, life and the other thing. Samhain, pronounced Samhain in Irish, S-Och-Win in some Scottish forms, marked the end of summer, the final harvest, the moment the door to winter swung open. Herds came down from the hills. Cattle were counted, culled, and driven between twin bonfires for blessing. Rent and tribute were paid. Laws were renewed. Kings were tested. And, not by accident, truths were told that were unsafe at any other time. Why this night? Because the world itself was liminal, between seasons, between labors, between breath and frost. The Celts loved thresholds, dusk and dawn, crossroads and doorways, summer's end and winter's birth. And thresholds, they believed, belong to the beings who live in the in-between. Don't picture Tinker Bell. Picture neighbors you don't dare offend, whose neighborhood happens to be under the hills. The Irish called them the Ios Sea, the people of the mounds, not ghosts in the Victorian sense, but a formidable parallel nation whose courts occupied the hollow hills and ancient burial mounds dotting the landscape. Their queens, like the Morrigan, could bless kings and break them. Their lords hosted feasts no mortal should accept lightly. Their hospitality was dangerous. Their anger was worse. On Samhain night, the doorways of the etched, the mounds, were said to stand open. People left plates by the hearth, lamps in the window, food at the threshold, not out of fear, exactly, out of respect, out of love for those who had died, and out of a pragmatic instinct passed down from generation to generation. You settle accounts with your invisible neighbors, or you live with the consequences. What kind of consequences? Milk soured, cattle balked, children fell ill. A healthy infant suddenly changed, too quiet, too old in the eyes, as if something had been swapped when no one was looking. Those changeling stories weren't about superstition for superstition's sake. They were code, warnings, rituals wrapped around grief and mystery and the terrible unpredictability of life on the edge of winter. And then there were the monsters, the púca, the shapeshifter who loved to lead travelers astray, the dullahan, the headless rider. In Wales, on their own version of this night, Calan Gaeaf, people whispered about a tailless black sow and a spectral figure who chased stragglers away from the liminal dark. These weren't Halloween costumes. They were boundary markers, folkways, in the shape of fear. If you think all this sounds like a medieval hallucination, step into the archaeology. On the hill of Tara, the ancient royal seat, there's a passage tomb called the Mound of the Hostages. Its narrow stone corridor is aligned so that the rising sun illuminates the interior chamber around the beginning of November and again in early February. In other words, around Samhain and its mirror feast. Imbolc. This isn't a pumpkin patch. This is stone and winter light doing what priests and poets said the world does. Open at the right time. And that French Gaulish bronze calendar found at Coligny, it names a month, Samonios, the root of our Samhain, at the dark turning point of the year. It marks a 3-night festival, the trinox samoni. 3 nights when something started and stopped. The list doesn't say thin veil. It doesn't need to. It encodes it. The mythic layer agrees. At Tara, every Samhain, a creature called Eilean would lull the court to sleep with enchantment, and then burn the halls to ash with blasts of fire year after year, until a youth named Fionn Macumhale found a way to stay awake and slay the burner. The message was obvious. At the hinge of the year, forces test the center. If the king sleeps, the kingdom burns. If the warrior holds the line, the light survives for now. And yet, the thin veil wasn't only about threat, it was about access. If your grandmother had died that spring, Samhain wasn't a horror film. It was a chance to speak across the threshold. Some households held a dumb supper, a meal eaten in deliberate silence, with an empty chair laid for the departed. The old stories don't use our modern phrase, but the behavior tells you what they believed. On this night, you can invite the loved dead home, and if you're careful, they will come. You can hear the other half of the ritual, not the guests, but the hosts, in the games. Apples and hazelnuts were children's divination tools because they were sacred foods. Bobbing for apples wasn't a slapstick dunk tank so much as a courtship with fate. Peel an apple in one unbroken strip and toss it over your shoulder. The shape on the floor might show the initial of your future spouse. Drop 2 hazelnuts into the fire and name them. If they leapt together, love. If they popped apart, not tonight. These weren't stupid tricks. They were reminders that life turns on chance, and that the future is a kind of otherworld, too. But if the thin veil is real, as a cultural idea, as a ritual season, then someone will try to manage it. Enter the church. In late antiquity and early medieval Europe, the church had a problem and a talent. The problem: it could not erase the ritual logic of places and times that mattered to people long before anyone heard a sermon in Latin. The talent: it could absorb them. There had been feasts for saints before. There had even been a day to honor all of them in early summer. But by the 8th century, Rome dedicated a chapel on November 1st to the Feast of All Saints. A century later, that date went universal. The next day, November 2nd, was given to All Souls for the departed faithful. Now tell me, is that coincidence or management? It's neat to say the church stole Samhain. It's neater and truer to say it laid a new song over the same old drumbeat. Farmers still brought their herds down when the grass died. Nights still stretched. The old fears and comforts still thrummed in the bones of Ireland and Scotland and Wales and Brittany. But now there was a sanctioned outlet for what people were going to do anyway. Remember the dead. Pray for them. Feed them even. And if the unseen showed up at your door, you had a cross, a candle, a Latin name to throw into the dark. And then there's the begging. In medieval England, Bands of the poor and the young knocked on doors asking for soul cakes in exchange for prayers for the dead of the household. They sang rhymes. They wore odd bits of dress. They performed. That wasn't juvenile extortion. That was a ritual economy. I feed your dead. You feed my living. And the world keeps turning as it should. Meanwhile, in Scotland and Ireland, children disguised themselves, going house to house in masks and cloaks, reciting verses, performing little tricks to earn fruits or nuts or coins. The mask wasn't just fun, it was armor. If you look like the visitor might pass you by, or it might visit in kindness. By the time these practices crossed the Atlantic with immigrants in the 19th century, they collided with another tradition. Urban mischief night, gate night, pranks, sometimes destructive. Communities, as communities do, found a solution. Ritualize it, organize it, contain it. You can keep your visitations, but they end by bedtime, and they involve candy. Listen to the phrase that nailed it into place. Trick or treat. Either you pay homage, or the spirits, tiny, sugar-hungry, giggling, play their tricks. It's a children's joke with a prehistoric echo. Pay the rent to the unseen, or the unseen will remind you who shares your street. But let's pause. There are two false notes that always sneak into this conversation. Two bits of fake lore we need to exercise before we go further. First, there was no Celtic god of death named Samhain. None. That confusion mixed Victorian enthusiasm, bad etymology, and some creative propaganda with a pinch of 20th century panic. Samhain is a season name, a threshold, a festival. If the older Irish pantheon has a god of death, he doesn't answer to October. Second, the thin veil as a phrase is mostly modern. You won't find medieval monks using those exact words, but sift the sources and practices and you'll find them describing the same behavior. This is when the mounds open. This is when the dead can walk. This is when the doors between courts, ours and theirs, stand ajar. The metaphor may be new. The model is old. And speaking of models, there's a subtle conspiracy here, not one of hooded figures, but of calendars. Think about how many cultures have days when the underworld leaks. The Romans had a pit in the Forum called the mundus. 3 times a year they opened it and said the spirits were free to roam. In Mesoamerica, pre-Hispanic rites for the dead migrated under Christian names into Dia de Muertos. In Slavic lands, there are spring and autumn ancestor days. In East Asia, the hungry ghosts get their festival in the heat of summer. The liminal principle persists, adapted to local cycles. So, what are the Celts doing? They're anchoring the hinge not at the solstice or the equinox, but almost halfway between the cross-quarter day, when the light has slid far enough to make it psychologically undeniable. Your body knows, your animals know. Your sky tells you you're crossing into the lean time. This is when you remember who helps you survive. The living, the dead, the neighbors under the hill, all of them. And some landscapes don't let you forget. At Rathcroghan, Oweynagat's mouth yawns low and black, with an ancient lintel stone engraved in Ogham, the old Irish script. Tradition insists that from this hole in the earth came flocks of monstrous birds and herds of wild pigs and armies led by a war queen whose name tastes like iron. It's narrative, yes, but it's also geography as theology, place as policy, keep away unless invited, or bring milk and courage. Move north and east to the hill of Tara again, to that tomb aligned to winter's frontier light. Think of whoever decided that a shaft of November's sun should pierce a cold stone room in a royal center. That's engineering. That's spiritual architecture. That's a veil measured in degrees of sunrise, not in fear, and swing across the sea. In the Scottish Highlands, they hollowed out monstrous turnips, yes, turnips, into grimacing lanterns and carried them to ward off the púca. The American pumpkin is a New World recruit, softer to carve, brighter to burn. But the face we cut, the candle we place, the message we send into the night, that is old. It says, I see you, I honor you, not tonight. Meanwhile, the Welsh left offerings on Ysbrydnos, the spirit night, and raced home before the church's midnight strike. The Bretons of Armorica, cousins of these peoples, kept Calan Gaeaf, the first of winter, with ways of their own. Pan-Celtic, regional, adapted, one logic, many dialects. Now for a harder angle. Why would the powerful care about all this? Because Samhain was a king's test. Hospitality could crown or destroy you. If your court was poor, your people noticed. If your judgments were unjust, stories would bend around you and break you in the telling. Take Eilean's yearly burning of Tara. It's not just a monster of the week tale. It's a political critique disguised as myth. An elite that sleeps through the danger invites the fire. A leader who can keep his eyes open, who can stay awake to the world's actual forces, is the one you want when the door swings open again next year. And look closer at Nera's story. He spends a year and a day in the Otherworld. He learns that his enemy will attack. He escapes with the knowledge, and his people raid the Cid in return. It's a fantasy of espionage, of foreknowledge, of turning a liminal edge into a strategic weapon. How do you govern a liminal nation? You master the thresholds. You time the doors. Now fold history back in. After the church's calendar settled into place, Halloween's hybrid form kept shifting. In England, All Hallowtide intertwined with souling. In Scotland and Ireland, guising matured, fueled by the same appetite for laughter and luck and acknowledgement of risk. In early modern Britain, Bonfire Night, November 5th, competed for the season's mischief energy, spinning nights of pranks and parades and fires. In America, by the early 20th century, Halloween became notorious for rowdy vandalism, so much so that civic leaders and magazines urged organized parties and door-to-door treats to tame it. By the 1930s to 1950s, trick or treat had taken off. And the candy followed. So did costumes and boxed plastic. So did suburban streets. tuned to the rhythm of doorbells and flashlight beams. If you're a skeptic, you'll say, capitalism domesticated the dead. If you're a mythographer, you'll say, the treaty found a new clause. Households that pay tribute, fun-sized, bite-sized, are briefly, safely haunted. But the modern era added its own ghosts. The razor blade in the apple, mostly a myth. The satanic panic of the 1980s, a moral frenzy that told us more about our fears than about any coven's calendar. What those panics did, unintentionally, was reenact the old Samhain script in a modern register. Thresholds are risky. Strangers are powerful. Take care of your children. Build community defenses. Keep the lights bright. Don't wander off the path. Ancient neurochemistry, updated for cul-de-sacs. And while all that was happening, something else stirred. A conscious revival. Neo-pagans and Wiccans reclaimed Samhain as a high holiday of remembrance and magic. They lit candles for the dead. They cast circles at the year's dark turn. They spoke the word Samhain as a living ritual, not a museum artifact. Whether you share their practice or not, their insistence matters. It pushed Halloween's roots back into view through the candy wrappers and the costume aisles, down into the pact, the treaty, the acknowledgement that winter comes, and with it, everything we can't control. But I want to come back to the thin veil and tell you something you might not expect. It might be less mysticism than mathematics and still be magic. When anthropologists look at rites of passage, they see three phases: separation, liminality, reincorporation. The liminal phase is the in-between, dangerous, creative, disorienting. Societies use it to restructure the self. Samhain is a calendar-sized liminal phase. It takes a whole people to the threshold and holds them there for a night. The activities, masks, offerings, divinations, pranks are not random. They are technologies for managing liminality. They create safe containers for uncertainty. They turn raw fear into ritual play. They teach children how to face the dark and come home. In other words, whether or not you believe that the dead literally cross on October 31st, you participate in a proof. You feel the edge. You notice the shift. You rehearse mortality in miniature. You go out in disguise. You risk. You receive. You return. You move through the door and back again. If that's not a veil, tell me what is. And yet, the old stories whisper that sometimes someone doesn't come back the same. Nera returned from the Mound and discovered he'd been gone a year. He had a wife on the other side now. He had knowledge no one else had. His people attacked the Mound and retrieved goods and captives, but the Otherworld door did not close forever. How could it? Once a door is known, it remains a possibility. Once a pattern is taught, a people can choose it. Every Samhain after that, not just Nera's, not just Fion's, becomes a negotiation with the same question. How much of the other side do we let in this time? Which brings us to the conspiracy everyone misses. The thin veil was never only about the dead. It was about the living, about keeping a community elastic enough to survive winter, about permitting a night of reversed roles so the rest of the year could be stable, about letting in just enough chaos to refresh the order. That's a social technology. That's not naive. That's genius. When Victorian reformers cleaned Halloween up, when mid-century America made it safe and sweet, they weren't destroying Samhain. They were doing what elites at Terra did, managing the fire so the hall wouldn't burn. And still, the old fires leak. Watch the way your street behaves on Halloween night. Doors that stay shut all year open. Neighbors who never speak smile and hand over a gift. Children, the only people society lets cross thresholds without suspicion, become spirits for a night and discover that strangers can be kind. The dead are remembered, formally, on November 2nd in churches, informally on mantles and Instagram posts. The treaty renews itself in driveways and on doorsteps, quietly, reliably, strange as ever. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the ancient questions alive in the fluff and plastic. Who are your invisible neighbors? What do you owe them? What happens if you forget? Under the candy, under the pumpkin spice, under the costumes stitched in sweatshops and the social media filters, there's the pressure of winter and the pull of memory. There's an old door in a low hill. There's a sun that pierces a passage on 2 mornings a year. There's a calendar on a bronze plate, written in a dead language that still names your night. There are plates set out in small kitchens with an extra slice for someone who isn't here and who might be. And there's an older way of measuring truth, not by fact-checking a headline, but by asking, does this rite do what it says on the tin? Does it carry us through the hinge and back again? If Halloween survives, it will be because it still does. Let's end where we began, with a paradox that feels like a dare. The scariest thing about Halloween isn't that the dead walk, it's that the living remember. They remember they are part of a chain that includes those who came before and those who will come after. They remember that society is a story we tell together, and that once a year we rewrite the contract between the seen and unseen, the safe and the wild, the ordinary and the sacred. And the veil, call it that, or call it timing and light, lifts just enough for us to see the haunted shape of our own lives. So next time you carve a face into a pumpkin, or light a candle and put it in a window, ask yourself, are you scaring something away, or signaling that it's safe to come home? Conclusion: when people say Halloween is just for kids, they're right, and they're wrong. It is for children, because it belongs to the part of us that still believes a door can be opened and closed with a word. But it's also for adults, because it's the one night a year that invites us to do what we avoid the other 364. Acknowledge our debts to the dead, stare at the winter coming, and speak to the part of ourselves that still needs mystery to be human. The Celts weren't obsessed with death. They were honest about cycles. They made a treaty with the unseen, a ritual pact that kept society flexible at the broken places. The church didn't erase that treaty so much as translate it. Modern culture didn't destroy it so much as costume it. And if you've ever felt a shiver of meaning on a cold October night, when the air smells like leaves and smoke and faraway laughter, you've felt it too, which leaves us with one last uncomfortable thought. If a culture can time a door, if it can engineer a moment when the unseen steps through, what else could we be timing without admitting it? And on the coming Halloween, when you open your door and someone you don't recognize is standing there in a mask, are they pretending to be something else? Or are you?